6:54 in the morning. December 7, 1941. On the deck of the USS Arizona, sailors were finishing breakfast. Some were writing letters home. Others were shaving or shining boots for Sunday inspection. The Hawaiian sun had barely climbed above the horizon. The band was preparing for morning colors. Then the sky filled with a sound no one on the island had ever heard before. A low mechanical drone. Then the whistle. Then the world came apart. Within 2 hours, 2,400 Americans were dead. 21 warships lay burning, capsized, or torn open along Battleship Row. The Arizona took a bomb down her forward magazine and split in half. 1,177 of her men died in a single moment. Most of them are still there. Their bones rest inside her hull to this day, beneath the memorial that spans her grave. The Oklahoma rolled over like a wounded animal. 429 of her crew would never come home. Oil burned on the water. Smoke blotted out the sun. A generation of American sailors died before they could finish their breakfast. 5,000 miles away, in a quiet Tokyo office lit by the gray winter morning, Prime Minister Hideki Tojo was smiling. He was 57 years old. A career army officer with steel-rimmed glasses and a face that betrayed nothing. He had spent months preparing for this moment. Now, just hours before the first bomb dropped in Hawaii, he met with Vice Minister of the Home Ministry Michio Yuzawa, and he said something that would not be revealed to the world for another 77 years. His words, preserved in a private memo, made public only in 2018. I am completely relieved. Given the current conditions, I could say we have practically won already. Tojo believed the war was over before it had begun. He was catastrophically wrong. And here is the strangest part of the whole story. The one man in Japan who knew Tojo was wrong, who had warned them for years, who had begged them not to do this, was the same man who had just planned the attack on Pearl Harbor. They had sent him to sea to keep him quiet. And in 3 years he would be dead, killed by American pilots reading his own mail. This is the story of how the leaders of Imperial Japan looked at the most powerful industrial nation on earth and saw a country of soft, spoiled, disunited weaklings. How they took accurate data about American factories and dismissed it. How they built an empire on assumptions that would turn to ash. And how one man, the man who planned Pearl Harbor itself, tried desperately to stop them and failed. To understand the miscalculation, you have to understand the belief. Long before the bombs fell, Japan had built a spiritual architecture that told its leaders they could not lose. It rested on 2 ancient pillars. The first was called Yamato Damashii, the Japanese spirit. It held that the people of the Japanese islands possessed a unique inner strength, a purity of will that could overcome any material disadvantage on earth. This was not empty propaganda. It was faith. Deep, cultural, unshakable faith. The second pillar was Bushido, the way of the warrior. It taught that death was preferable to surrender, that a man who fought for money or comfort or self-preservation was already defeated in his soul. Japanese planners looked at these 2 pillars and then they looked at America. They saw Hollywood movies. Loud, colorful, obsessed with pleasure. They saw dance halls and jazz clubs. They saw a country of immigrants, of Germans and Irish and Italians and Africans. People who shared no blood, no faith, no emperor. They saw the Great Depression, 10 million unemployed, breadlines stretching around city blocks. They saw the America First movement, hundreds of thousands strong, screaming that no American boy should ever again die in a foreign war. And they saw weakness. One American diplomat stationed in pre-war Nagoya wrote that Japanese elites admired American factories and American science, but felt nothing but contempt for the American soul. The average American, they concluded, was technically skilled but spiritually hollow. A worker. A consumer. A man who would fight for a paycheck and run when the shooting became serious. British historian H.P. Wilmot identified the belief that sat at the very center of Japanese strategic thinking. Japan was a nation created by the gods. Watched over by the gods. Ruled by a god, the emperor himself. In a war between such a nation and a country of shopkeepers, the outcome could not be in doubt. Spirit would defeat steel. And history seemed to prove it. In 1895, Japan crushed China and seized Taiwan. Then in 1905, Japan did something the world thought impossible. It defeated Russia, a European great power, in a full-scale war. A surprise naval attack crippled the Russian fleet at Port Arthur before war was even declared. The land campaign in Manchuria was brutal, unimaginable in its cost, but Japan endured casualties that would have broken a softer nation. And then, at the Battle of Tsushima, in one of the most one-sided naval engagements in human history, Japan annihilated the Russian Baltic Fleet after it had sailed 18,000 miles to reach the Pacific. Russia sued for peace. The larger power, the wealthier power, the wider power, had calculated that victory was not worth the price, and had negotiated on terms favorable to Japan. In 1941 this was the template. Strike first. Strike hard. Seize a vast perimeter. Make the cost of retaking it so terrible that the Americans, soft and comfort-loving, would count their dead and negotiate. Just like Russia. Just like 1905. There was only one problem. The man who had planned Pearl Harbor knew it would not work. His name was Isoroku Yamamoto, Admiral, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet. 57 years old. Missing the index and middle fingers of his left hand, torn away in 1905 when a gun aboard his cruiser Nishin exploded during the Battle of Tsushima itself. He was Japan's most brilliant naval strategist. And he did not want this war. Yamamoto was not like the other admirals in Tokyo. He had lived in America. From 1919 to 1921, he had studied at Harvard University, walking the streets of Cambridge, learning to think in English, absorbing not just the language but the temperament of the American people. Later, from 1926 to 1928, he served as naval attaché in Washington, and he did something few Japanese officers of his rank ever did. He traveled. Not just to embassies and ports. He went into the American interior. He walked through the automobile factories of Detroit and watched the assembly lines run. He rode through the oil fields of Texas, mile after mile, derrick after derrick, an ocean of black wealth beneath the American earth. He played poker in smoke-filled rooms, and he learned something the game teaches every serious player. When you are beaten, you fold. You do not throw good money after bad. What he saw terrified him. His colleagues in Tokyo knew America only through diplomatic cables and intelligence summaries. Yamamoto had walked the ground. He had spoken to workers on shop floors. He had seen the roads, the trucks, the endless rows of houses, the sheer, casual, staggering scale of American industrial life. He understood something the men in Tokyo could not conceive. Those car factories could become tank factories. Those oil wells could fuel a fleet larger than anything Japan could dream. And those cheerful, informal, jazz-loving Americans, when roused, would fight with a fury that would match any samurai. He said so. Out loud. Repeatedly. Anyone who has seen the auto factories in Detroit and the oil fields in Texas, he told his colleagues, knows that Japan lacks the national power for a naval race with America. To a group of school children in 1940 he said something even simpler. Japan cannot beat America. Therefore, Japan should not fight America. But the warning that would haunt history came in late 1940. Yamamoto sat before Prime Minister Fumimaro Kono, a thin, aristocratic man of 50 who had spent months trying to prevent the coming war, and he told him the truth. If I am told to fight regardless of the consequences, I shall run wild for the first 6 months or a year. But I have utterly no confidence for the second or third year. Kono recorded these words in his memoir. They would prove devastatingly precise. The Battle of Midway, Japan's first catastrophic defeat, would come almost exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto had predicted his own failure with the accuracy of a prophet. In January of 1941, he wrote a letter to a politician named Ryoichi Sasakawa. In it he seemed to boast. Should hostilities once break out between Japan and the United States, it would not be enough that we take Guam and the Philippines, nor even Hawaii and San Francisco. To make victory certain, we would have to march into Washington and dictate the terms of peace in the White House. To modern ears it sounds like arrogance. It was not. It was the opposite. Yamamoto was demonstrating, by absurdity, the impossibility of victory. Total conquest of the American continent was obviously insane. Therefore, total victory was impossible. Therefore, war must be avoided. But no one wanted to hear it. The army dominated Japanese politics and the army wanted war. And Yamamoto's warnings had put him in danger. Not from the enemy. From his own countrymen. Ultranationalist fanatics had already assassinated several prominent opponents of war. Cabinet ministers. Generals. Anyone who spoke of peace was branded a traitor. Yamamoto had spoken loudly and openly and publicly. His name was on lists. There were men in Tokyo, young officers with swords and revolvers, who believed his death would purify the nation. So the Navy sent him to sea. The man who would plan the attack on Pearl Harbor was assigned to command the combined fleet not only because of his brilliance, but because a warship at sea was safer than an office in Tokyo. The architect of Japan's boldest offensive was, at that very moment, being hunted by his own people for the crime of telling them they could not win. Think about that. The most valuable strategic mind in the Imperial Japanese Navy was being smuggled onto a battleship to keep him alive. When war became inevitable, Yamamoto made a choice that many have called cynical, and many have called tragic, and both are correct. He concluded that if the war had to be fought, no one else was competent to fight it. "I cannot see anyone but myself in charge of it," he said. And so the man who had spent years trying to stop the war became the man who designed its opening blow. Pearl Harbor was not, in his mind, a plan for victory. It was a desperate gamble to buy time. A knockout punch that might, just might, stun the Americans long enough for Japan to build its perimeter and consolidate its gains before American industry could awaken. He knew the odds. He had done the arithmetic. He was betting on shock. He was betting on isolation. He was betting that the country he had walked through for years would flinch. On December 1, 1941, an imperial conference in Tokyo formally approved the war. It rested on 5 interlocking assumptions. 1. American isolationism was too deep to be broken by a distant attack. 2. The war would be fought too far from the American mainland for ordinary citizens to sustain interest. 3. Destroying the Pacific Fleet would eliminate American power projection for 12 to 18 months, long enough for Japan to fortify its perimeter. 4. Germany would keep Britain and America occupied in Europe. 5. Americans, unwilling to bleed for distant colonial rocks, would negotiate. Just like Russia in 1905. Every one of these assumptions would prove wrong. The chief of the Naval General Staff, Admiral Osamu Nagano, 61 years old, gave the decision its final, terrible logic. His words are not strategy. They are the sound of a man who has run out of ideas. Since Japan is unavoidably facing national ruin whether it decides to fight or not, it must by all means choose to fight. Japan would rather go down fighting than ignobly surrender without a struggle. Because surrender would spell spiritual as well as physical ruin. Read those words again. Slowly. This is not a plan. This is not calculation. This is a man in a room full of men who have all convinced themselves that the only way to avoid ruin is to embrace it. The historian Eri Hata, after years of archival research, reached a conclusion that should stop every viewer cold. When Japan attacked the United States in 1941, its leaders, in large part, understood they were entering a war they were almost certain to lose. They knew. They chose it anyway. And so, on the cold morning of December 7, 6:54 in Hawaii, the first bombs fell. In Tokyo, a prime minister smiled and declared the war already won. On the deck of the battleship Nagato, an admiral who had walked the streets of Cambridge and driven through the oil fields of Texas received the news of the strike he himself had designed. He did not celebrate. Historians describe him as somber, quiet, withdrawn, because he alone, in the highest ranks of Japanese command, understood what had just been done. Not a victory. A door had been opened, and on the other side of it stood a country he knew better than any of his colleagues did. A country of 230,000 factories. A country of 10 million idle workers waiting to be called. A country that had elected its own president 3 times, that had never in its history lost a war it fully committed to, and that had just been given, in one morning of fire and smoke over Pearl Harbor, a unifying wound that would not close for 4 years. The men who planned this war believed they had struck a decisive blow against a soft and divided enemy. They had, in fact, just woken the largest industrial machine in the history of the human race, and given it a single, burning, unified purpose. And the man who understood this best was the one who had just delivered the blow. For 6 months, everything went right. That was the poison. That was the thing that would destroy them. Not the defeats. The victories. In the first days after Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces moved across the Pacific with a speed that shocked even their own planners. Guam fell on December 10th. The American garrison there numbered about 550 men. They had roughly 100 rifles between them. No artillery. No aircraft. They fought for a few hours and then it was over. Wake Island held longer. On a coral atoll smaller than most American farms, a garrison of Marines and civilian construction workers stood their ground. On December 11th, when the first Japanese landing force approached, the defenders did something no one thought possible. They fought them off. Shore batteries opened up at close range. Marine Wildcat fighters dove out of the sky. 2 Japanese destroyers, the Hay-8 and the Kisaragi, were sunk. Others limped away burning. It was the only time in the entire opening Japanese offensive that an amphibious landing was repelled. The only time. Commander Winfield Scott Cunningham sent one of the war's shortest, most haunting messages back to Pearl Harbor as the second larger Japanese force closed in. Enemy on island. Issue in doubt. Wake fell on December 23. The garrison was overwhelmed. But those 16 days had cost Japan ships, men and time. And more than that, they had sent a signal, a warning that Japanese planners chose not to hear. The signal was drowned out by everything else. Singapore, the great British fortress in the east, the Gibraltar of the Pacific, fell on February 15, 1942. 85,000 British and Commonwealth soldiers laid down their arms. It remains the largest capitulation in British military history. General Tomoyuki Yamashita had taken it in 70 days, coming down through the jungle on bicycles while the great naval guns of Singapore pointed uselessly out to sea, waiting for an attack from the water that never came. Then came the Philippines. For 3 months, American and Filipino soldiers held the Bataan Peninsula. They lived on half rations, then quarter rations. They boiled leaves. They ate mules. Malaria burned through them. Dysentery emptied them. By the end, fewer than half were considered combat effective, and combat effective meant they could still stand. On April 9, 1942, Major General Edward King surrendered approximately 75,000 American and Filipino troops. It remains the largest surrender in American military history. And then came the Death March. 65 miles under the tropical sun. Men who had already been starving for 3 months were forced to walk in columns, without food, without water. Those who fell were bayoneted where they lay. Those who begged for water were shot. Somewhere between 500 and 650 Americans died on that road. Between 5,000 and 18,000 Filipinos died beside them. Corregidor, the fortress island at the mouth of Manila Bay, held out for another month. It fell on May 6. General Jonathan Wainwright went into a Japanese prison camp and would not come out until 1945. In Tokyo, the maps kept changing. New arrows. New territories. New victories. In 6 months, the Japanese Empire had expanded to cover 1/7 of the surface of the earth. From the frozen Aleutians in the north to the jungles of New Guinea in the south. From the borders of India in the west to the doorstep of Hawaii in the east. The pre-war plans had assumed Japan would lose about a quarter of its attacking forces in the initial offensives. Actual losses had been almost nothing. And this is where the disease began. The Japanese themselves gave it a name. Senshubyo. Victory disease. And it infected every level of command. By March of 1942, Japanese military leadership was concluding that their war plans had been too cautious. Too pessimistic. Perhaps, they whispered to each other in the wood-paneled rooms of the Imperial Palace, perhaps spirit really could triumph over material. Perhaps the old admirals had been right all along. They were, at that very moment, on the edge of a cliff. And they did not see it. Because the warnings had all been there. Wake Island had bloodied them. Bataan had delayed their timetable by months, forcing them to shift reinforcements meant for other operations. American and Filipino soldiers on Corregidor had fought to the last shell. These were early signals that the men Japan was fighting were not the men Japan had described in its intelligence reports. But in the flush of easy triumph, the signals were dismissed. Anomalies. Exceptions. Nothing worth changing the plan for. And then, on April 18, 1942, the Americans did something that was not supposed to be possible. They bombed Tokyo. 650 miles from the Japanese coast, aboard the aircraft carrier USS Hornet, 16 twin-engine B-25 Mitchell bombers sat on the flight deck. Medium bombers. Land-based aircraft. They were not designed to fly from ships. They could take off from a carrier, if you stripped them down to almost nothing and hit the throttle at the exact right moment. But they could not land back on one. There was no way to recover them. Which meant this was a one-way mission. 80 American airmen volunteered to fly it. Their commander was a 45-year-old lieutenant colonel named James Doolittle, a test pilot before the war. A man who had raced airplanes for a living and had a doctorate in aeronautical engineering. He would fly the lead bomber himself. The plan was simple and it was insane. Take off from the Hornet. Bomb Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, Osaka, and Kobe. Then keep flying west across the sea, and try to reach friendly airfields in unoccupied China before the fuel ran out. At around 8 in the morning on April 18, they went. One by one, the bombers rolled down the pitching flight deck, engines screaming, and lifted off into the gray Pacific sky. The physical damage they did to Japan was almost nothing. A few dozen buildings destroyed. Roughly 50 Japanese killed. But that was never the point. For America, the raid arrived like a hand pulling a drowning man out of the water. For 4 months since Pearl Harbor, the news had been nothing but defeat. Guam, Wik, Singapore, Bataan, Corregidor. Americans had begun to wonder if their country could hit back at all. And then the headlines came. American bombs on the streets of Tokyo. The details did not matter. The picture in every man's mind was what mattered. And in every diner in every American town, men who had lost friends at Pearl Harbor allowed themselves for the first time to smile. In Japan, the effect was very different. The emperor had been assured that his sacred person would never be endangered by enemy attack. The people had been told that the home islands were untouchable. Now, in broad daylight, American aircraft had flown over the imperial capital. Bombs had fallen within sight of the palace. The military lost face. The public lost certainty. And the army, which had for months been resisting Admiral Yamamoto's proposal for a major operation against the American carriers, suddenly changed its mind. Yamamoto had been arguing for months that Japan needed to draw the surviving American aircraft carriers into a decisive battle and destroy them. The carriers had not been at Pearl Harbor on December 7th. They were still out there, and as long as they were, the Pacific was not secure. He had proposed an operation to take a small atoll called Midway at the edge of the Hawaiian chain and use it as bait. The Americans would have to come defend it. When they did, the full weight of the Japanese fleet would fall on them. The army had said no. Too risky. Too far. Too expensive. Then Doolittle's bombers appeared over Tokyo. And every argument the army had made about the American carrier threat being tolerable collapsed in a single afternoon. The Midway operation was approved. It was rushed. It was overconfident. And it would become the greatest naval disaster in modern Japanese history. Before we get to Midway, though, something happened in early May that most people have forgotten, but that would decide everything. In the Coral Sea, off the northeast coast of Australia, 2 Japanese carriers and 2 American carriers found each other. Or rather, their aircraft did. The ships themselves never saw one another. Not once. For the first time in the history of naval warfare, an entire major battle was fought by aircraft alone, between fleets that were more than 100 miles apart. The Americans lost the carrier Lexington. Another carrier, the USS Yorktown, took a heavy bomb hit that punched through her flight deck and blew out compartments deep in her hull. Smoke poured from her for hours. She limped away, listing wounded. The Japanese commanders reported her sunk. They were wrong. Remember that. It matters more than any of them could have known. Yorktown crawled back to Pearl Harbor at reduced speed, and when she arrived, the shipyard commanders came aboard and shook their heads. 3 months of repairs, they said. Minimum. They had 72 hours. What happened in those 72 hours belongs in a museum. 1,600 welders, riveters, and shipfitters swarmed over the Yorktown day and night. They worked in shifts that never stopped. They cut new steel. They welded patches over holes big enough to drive a car through. They rewired what could be rewired and left the rest hanging. On May 30, 1942, the Yorktown steamed out of Pearl Harbor toward Midway, held together by improvisation and stubbornness, with civilian yard workers still on board finishing repairs as she sailed. The Japanese did not know she was coming. They believed she was on the bottom of the Coral Sea. Meanwhile, in a windowless basement office at Pearl Harbor, a group of men had been doing something no one in Tokyo believed was possible. They were reading Japanese mail. Their commander was a lieutenant commander named Joseph Rockefort, 42 years old, a former enlisted man who had come up through the ranks. He wore a red smoking jacket and slippers to work because the basement was cold and he did not care what anyone thought. He was one of the most brilliant cryptanalysts the United States Navy would ever produce. Rockefort's team, Station HYPO, had been chipping away at the Japanese Naval Code Jan 25B for months. By late May, they could read enough of it to know that Yamamoto was planning a major operation. They could see the ships being assembled. They could see the timelines. They could see a target referred to in the intercepts by two letters. Rockefort was certain AF was Midway. Washington was not. There was a fierce debate. Some analysts insisted AF meant the Aleutians or Hawaii itself, or even the American West Coast. If Rockefort was wrong, the entire Pacific Fleet would sail into an ambush at Midway while Japanese forces took some other target undefended. So one of Rockefort's officers, Lieutenant Jasper Holmes, proposed a trap. The Midway garrison was ordered to send a message in the clear, unencrypted, saying that its water distillation plant had broken down and the island was short of fresh water. It was a routine message. It looked like nothing. Within 48 hours, Station HYPO intercepted a Japanese naval communication reporting to Tokyo that AF was short of water. That was it. That was the proof. Rockefort had been right. Admiral Chester Nimitz, the 56-year-old commander of the Pacific Fleet, a soft-spoken Texan with white hair and steady eyes, made the call. He committed almost everything he had. 3 carriers, including the wounded Yorktown that the Japanese had written off as dead, moved north of Midway to lie in wait. Yamamoto sailed into the trap with confidence. He had 4 fleet carriers, 2 light carriers, 11 battleships, and over 250 aircraft. His pilots were veterans. Some of them had flown at Pearl Harbor. Many of them had 1,000 hours of flight time. The Americans, by every measure, should have been destroyed. 3 carriers against 6. Green pilots against combat-hardened aces. The morning of June 4, 1942, dawned clear over the Pacific. Japanese scout planes searched the sea and found nothing. Nothing where the American fleet was supposed to be, because the American fleet was not where Yamamoto expected it to be. The Japanese launched their first strike against the island of Midway itself. And while their planes were in the air, an American scout finally spotted the Japanese carriers. The Americans launched everything they had. The first waves to reach the Japanese fleet were torpedo bombers. Slow, low-flying, obsolete aircraft called Devastators. They came in at wave-top height, straight into the guns of the Japanese screen. Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet arrived first. 15 aircraft. 30 men. Every single plane was shot down. 29 of the 30 crewmen died in the water or in flames. Only 1 man survived. Ensign George Gay, 25 years old, was pulled from his cockpit by his own sinking aircraft, floated up under a black rubber seat cushion he used for cover, and from that impossibly small piece of drifting foam, watched the rest of the battle unfold. More torpedo bombers came in behind them. From the Enterprise. From the Yorktown. They were slaughtered too. Not one American torpedo hit a Japanese ship. It looked, from the deck of Admiral Chuchi Nagumo's flagship Akagi, like a great and glorious victory. But those men, those doomed pilots in their obsolete planes, had done something without knowing it. They had pulled every Japanese fighter down to sea level. The Zeros were skimming the water, running down the last of the torpedo planes, when the sky above them at 15,000 feet, filled with something else. American dive bombers. SPD Dauntless. From the Enterprise and the Yorktown. Above them the sky was empty. Below them, 4 Japanese carriers sat in the open sea with their decks packed with fueled and armed aircraft preparing for the next strike. At around 10:22 in the morning, the American dive bombers rolled onto their targets and came down. 5 minutes. That is how long it took. 5 minutes to change the war in the Pacific. The Akagi took a single bomb near the center of her flight deck. That was enough. The deck was covered in fuel hoses and bombs and torpedoes. The explosion set off a chain reaction that turned her into an inferno. The Kaga took at least 4 hits and burned from bow to stern. The Soryu was struck 3 times in 3 minutes. 3 of Japan's 4 fleet carriers, the pride of the Navy that had attacked Pearl Harbor, were dying at the same moment. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, was still afloat that morning. She launched a counterstrike. Her planes found the Yorktown, the ship the Japanese had already sunk once in their own imaginations, and hit her again. 3 bombs. 2 torpedoes. But by late afternoon, American dive bombers found Hiryu too. By the time the sun set on June 4th, all 4 of Japan's fleet carriers were sinking or already gone. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu. The heart of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the striking force that had opened the war, was on the bottom of the Pacific. Japan lost more than 3,000 men in that battle. Not just sailors, mechanics, armorers, deck crews. Aviation specialists who had taken a decade to train and could not be replaced in a year or 10 years. The knowledge that had built the Naval Air Force of Imperial Japan sank in one afternoon. Yamamoto, aboard his flagship Yamato hundreds of miles behind the battle, received the reports. Witnesses said he went very still. He canceled the operation. He retreated to his cabin and did not come out for a long time. Nagumo, the man whose ships had just been destroyed, was found by his chief of staff on the burning deck of the Akagi in a state that suggested he might be about to take his own life. His officers had to physically remove him from the ship. Yamamoto's 6-month prediction had come true almost to the day. And then Japan did something that reveals more about the disease inside its leadership than any battle could. Japan lied. To its own people. The Japanese Navy, with the Emperor's knowledge, reported Midway to the public as a great victory. The sunken carriers were kept on the official rosters as unassigned. Wounded sailors from the 4 dead ships were quarantined in separate hospitals. Their families were forbidden to visit them. The healthy survivors were transferred to remote posts where they could not talk about what they had seen. The Japanese people would not learn the truth about Midway until after the war had ended and the empire had already fallen. Think about what that means. The leaders of Japan understood that they had suffered a catastrophe. They understood that Yamamoto had been right, that the 6-month clock had run out. And their response was not to change course, not to seek terms, not to reconsider anything. Their response was to hide it. From their own citizens. From their own soldiers. From the mothers and fathers whose sons were about to be sent into a war that was already being lost. 2 months later, in the steaming jungles of the Solomon Islands, on an island most Americans could not find on a map, the second great illusion of the Japanese high command came apart. The illusion that Americans would not fight on land. The island was called Guadalcanal. On August 7, 1942, the 1st Marine Division under Major General Alexander van de Grift came ashore. Their target was a half-finished Japanese airfield in the middle of nowhere. That airfield, once captured, was renamed Henderson Field, after a Marine dive bomber pilot killed at Midway. And for the next 6 months, both sides poured men, ships, and aircraft into a fight for a strip of coral runway that neither of them had cared about a year before. The Japanese response was overconfidence layered on overconfidence. Colonel Kayaneo Ichiki, 49 years old, landed on the island with 916 men. His intelligence told him the American garrison was small and demoralized. He would drive them into the sea in a single night attack. On the night of August 21st, along a small river called the Tenaru, Ichiki launched his charge. His men came screaming out of the darkness with fixed bayonets. Marines in shallow foxholes on the far bank met them with machine guns. By dawn, about 800 Japanese soldiers were dead. American casualties were about 150. Colonel Ichiki, according to accounts, burned his regimental colors so they could not be captured and died on the field. Some historians believe he shot himself. Admiral Reizo Tanaka, one of the most capable Japanese officers in the theater, would later write with cold clarity what the Tenaru should have meant. This tragedy should have taught us the hopelessness of bamboo spear tactics. It did not. Because the officers in Tokyo could not accept what had happened. American troops, in their first significant land engagement of the war, had annihilated an elite Japanese assault force. Could not be true. There had to be another explanation. Perhaps Ichiki had made a mistake. Perhaps his force had been too small. More men would succeed where fewer had failed. More men came. And more died. Major General Kyote Kawaguchi threw 6,000 men at a ridge held by Marine paratroopers and raiders in September. He lost more than half of them. In late October, General Murayama sent roughly 7,000 men in wave after wave of frontal assault against the perimeter around Henderson Field. American defenders lost about 60 killed. They inflicted between 1,500 and 3,000 Japanese dead. And during that battle, on a hill in the darkness, a 25-year-old Marine sergeant from Raritan, New Jersey, named John Basilone did something that would put his name in every Marine Corps history book ever written. Basilone commanded 2 sections of heavy machine guns. Around 3,000 Japanese soldiers from the Sendai Regiment came at his position through the night. For 3 days and 3 nights, without sleep, without hot food, without rest, he kept his guns firing. When one section of guns was destroyed, he picked up a 90-pound machine gun and carried it 200 yards under enemy fire to replace it. When his ammunition ran out, he fought through Japanese lines with a pistol and a machete to bring more back to his men. He was the first enlisted Marine of World War II to receive the Medal of Honor. When it was pinned on him, he said something short, and it deserves to be quoted exactly as he said it. "Only part of this medal belongs to me. Pieces of it belong to the boys who are still on Guadalcanal." The Japanese renamed Guadalcanal Starvation Island. It was a bitter joke on the island's Japanese pronunciation. Between 25,000 and 31,000 Japanese soldiers died there. Many of them did not die from American bullets. They died from malaria, from dysentery, from starvation because American air power and naval forces had cut their supply lines, and no food was reaching them. Japan lost about 680 aircraft in the Solomons campaigns, along with 38 naval vessels. Most of the veteran pilots who had flown at Pearl Harbor, and who had survived Midway, did not survive Guadalcanal. A Japanese naval captain named Toshikazu Ami wrote after the war about what the campaign had revealed. He was blunt. The outstanding feature in the Guadalcanal campaign was the employment of radar by the United States, which completely reversed the Japanese Navy's traditional superiority in night engagements. The fact that the Japanese lost confidence in night engagements was a bad influence upon the morale of the men. Steel had defeated spirit. Circuits and vacuum tubes and cathode ray screens. Radar. That was all it had taken. By the spring of 1943, Admiral Yamamoto was flying to the front lines to inspect his troops in the Solomons. His flight schedule was transmitted by radio in code. Station HYPO read it. On April 18, 1943, exactly 1 year to the day after Doolittle's bombers had appeared over Tokyo, 16 American P-38 Lightning fighters, flying at extreme range with drop tanks, waited above the jungles of Bougainville. When the Japanese transports carrying Yamamoto and his staff came into view, they came down. The Admiral's aircraft went down burning into the jungle. When Japanese search parties found him the next day, he was still strapped into his seat. His white-gloved hand was closed around the hilt of his ceremonial samurai sword. The man who had known America best, the man who had walked through Detroit and Texas and Cambridge, the man who had warned them all, was killed by American pilots guided by American codebreakers, using aircraft built in American factories. He had told them. And in the end, his own words had come true. And behind him, across the Pacific, the machine he had feared was only just beginning to wake up. By 1944, the numbers were beyond belief. American factories produced 96,318 aircraft in a single year. That is more aircraft in 1 year than Japan built in the entire war. American shipyards under Henry Kaiser were launching Liberty ships at an average of 41 days per vessel. One ship, the SS Robert E. Peary, was assembled from keel laying to launch in 4 days, 15 hours and 29 minutes. 250,000 parts. 14 million pounds of steel. 4.5 days. Japanese intelligence had estimated that the United States Navy had about 309,000 personnel by late 1943. The actual number was 2,370,000. They had been wrong by a factor of 7. In June of 1944, in a battle over the Marianas Islands that American pilots would nickname the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, Japanese naval aviation ceased to exist as a fighting force. The kill ratio on the first day approached 12-1. Nearly 600 Japanese aircraft went down. 3 carriers were sunk. Whatever remained of the trained naval air force that had struck Pearl Harbor 30 months earlier was gone. The men in Tokyo had believed on December 7, 1941, that they had struck a decisive blow. They had not struck a blow. They had lit a fuse. And the explosion was only now beginning. The Americans came and they did not stop. Island by island, reef by reef. Every piece of coral the Japanese had spent 2 years fortifying, the Americans took back. Not gently, not cheaply. With a grinding, methodical, unstoppable weight that the men in Tokyo had convinced themselves the American character could not sustain. They had been wrong about that too. In November of 1943, the Marines went ashore at a place called Tarawa. It was a coral atoll in the middle of the Pacific. 2 miles long. Half a mile wide. A place no American had heard of a year before. The Japanese garrison was commanded by a rear admiral named Keiji Shibasaki, and before the battle he had said something that would follow him into every history book ever written. 1 million men could not take Tarawa in 100 years. The Marines took it in 76 hours. But the cost was terrible. The Navy had underestimated the tide. Landing craft grounded on the reef hundreds of yards from shore. Marines had to climb out into chest-deep water and wade toward the beach through machine gun fire, holding their rifles above their heads. Men fell and did not get up. The water turned red for 100 yards out. On the beach itself, they crawled forward over the bodies of their friends. 1,009 Marines died in 3 days. 2,100 more were wounded. For a strip of sand smaller than most American shopping mall parking lots. American newspapers ran the photographs. Bodies floating in the surf. Bodies stacked at the seawall. There was outrage. There were letters to congressmen. There were mothers in Ohio and Texas and California who read those articles and understood for the first time what the Pacific was going to cost. And the American war effort did not falter. The Navy went back to the drawing board. Underwater demolition teams were created, the men who would later become the Navy SEALs. New armored landing craft called Amtraks were rushed into production, vehicles that could crawl over the reefs where the wooden Higgins boats had grounded. Reconnaissance methods were rewritten. Bombardment procedures were rebuilt. Every death on Tarawa became a lesson written into the training manuals for the next island. And the next. And the next. The men in Tokyo had believed that the American public would recoil at the sight of American dead. The American public grieved. And then it bought more war bonds. In June of 1944, the Marines and Army went ashore at Saipan in the Mariana Islands. This was not just another island. This was the wall. This was the boundary of what Japanese planners had called their absolute national defense zone. Saipan was close enough to Tokyo that if it fell, American B-29 bombers could reach the Japanese home islands themselves. Not hit-and-run raids like Doolittle. Sustained bombing. Night after night after night. The Japanese garrison numbered around 32,000 men. The battle lasted 3 weeks. On July 7th, in the darkness before dawn, the largest banzai charge of the entire Pacific War came out of the jungle. Approximately 4,300 Japanese soldiers, many of them wounded, many of them sick, some of them carrying only bamboo spears, threw themselves against the American lines in a 15-hour assault. 2 American Army battalions were nearly annihilated. The Japanese kept coming. Wave after wave. Some of them running over the bodies of the dead in front of them. When it was over, they were almost all gone. Of the 32,000 Japanese defenders on Saipan, only 931 surrendered. And then, on the northern cliffs of the island, something happened that broke the hearts of the American soldiers who witnessed it. Japanese civilians, thousands of them, had been told by their own military that the Americans would rape them and torture them and kill their children. As the American lines closed in on the northern tip of Saipan, entire families walked to the edges of the cliffs. Mothers carrying babies. Old men. Little girls in white dresses. And they jumped. An estimated 22,000 Japanese civilians died on Saipan. Many by their own hand. Some by their own governments in the last hours. The propaganda that had built the empire had come home to kill the people who believed it. When the news of Saipan's fall reached Tokyo, something happened that had not happened in the entire war. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, the man who had said in December of 1941 that Japan had already won, resigned. The empire had lost the man who had led it into ruin. He did not go quietly. He did not admit publicly that he had been wrong. But every man in the government understood what his resignation meant. The 5 assumptions of the Imperial Conference had all failed. The Americans had not stayed home. They had not lost interest. They had not negotiated. They had not stopped. They were coming. By early 1945, the American perimeter had closed to within striking distance of the Japanese home islands themselves. And in February the Marines went ashore at Iwo Jima. Iwo Jima was 8 square miles of black volcanic rock. It stank of sulfur. Nothing grew there. And the Japanese commander who was defending it, Lieutenant General Tadamaki Kuribayashi, 53 years old, had done something no Japanese commander had done before. He had thrown out the manual. Kuribayashi had studied in the United States and Canada in the 1920s. He, like Yamamoto, had walked American streets and knew what he was facing. He forbade the banzai charges that had squandered Japanese lives on every previous island. He forbade the coastal defense doctrine that placed troops at the shoreline to be pulverized by American naval guns. Instead, he ordered his men to dig, and dig, and dig. By the time the Marines came ashore on February 19, 1945, the island of Iwo Jima had been hollowed out. 11 miles of underground tunnels connected concealed bunkers, artillery positions and rifle pits. The Japanese defenders were not on the island. They were in it. The battle lasted 36 days. 6,821 Americans died. 19,000 more were wounded. Iwo Jima was one of the very few Pacific battles in which total American casualties were higher than Japanese. Was that hard? Was that costly? And among the men who came ashore on that first morning was a Marine gunnery sergeant from Raritan, New Jersey, who had already been a legend for 2 years. John Basilone had come home from Guadalcanal a national hero. The Medal of Honor around his neck had made him one of the most recognizable Marines in America. The Marine Corps had wanted to send him on a war bond tour. Speeches, parades, photographs with movie stars. Anywhere but the front. He had refused. He had refused a commission as an officer. He had refused a comfortable stateside assignment. And when they had pressed him on why, he had given them an answer that Marines have been quoting to each other ever since. I ain't no officer. And I ain't no museum piece. I belong back with my outfit. He went back. On February 19, 1945, on the black volcanic sand of Iwo Jima, Gunnery Sergeant John Basilone was leading a machine gun section against a Japanese blockhouse. He worked his way forward under fire, single-handedly took out the position, and was moving to guide a tank through a minefield when Japanese mortar rounds came down on him and his men. He was killed on the first day of the battle. He was 28 years old. They gave him the Navy Cross for what he did that morning. He remains the only enlisted Marine in American history to receive both the Medal of Honor and the Navy Cross. Somewhere in a small town in New Jersey, an old couple opened the door and found 2 men in uniform standing on the porch. In April, the Marines and Army went ashore at Okinawa, only 350 miles from the Japanese mainland. The battle lasted 82 days. 12,500 Americans died. 49,000 more were wounded. It was the bloodiest battle of the entire Pacific War for the United States. And in the skies above the fleet, the Japanese unveiled the last, most desperate weapon of the war. Kamikazes. The divine wind. Roughly 2,000 young Japanese pilots, some of them barely trained, climbed into aircraft loaded with high explosive and flew them directly into American ships. 368 Allied ships were damaged. 36 were sunk. The United States Navy at Okinawa suffered more casualties than in any single engagement in its history to that point. Out of a Japanese port to the north, the greatest battleship ever built, the Yamato, 70,000 tons of steel and guns, put to sea with orders to run itself aground at Okinawa and fire until it was destroyed. It had only enough fuel for a one-way trip. American carrier aircraft found it in the East China Sea and sank it before it could get anywhere near the battle. The pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the ship named for the ancient soul of the Japanese people, went to the bottom of the sea with nearly 2,500 sailors aboard, and never fired a shot at the enemy. By the summer of 1945, the Japanese Empire was no longer a nation. It was the wreckage of one. Oil imports had ceased completely in April. The Japanese Navy was gone. What ships remained sat rusting in harbors because there was no fuel to move them. New warships were being built out of wood because there was no steel. Trucks were being converted to burn charcoal because there was no gasoline. Pilots could not be trained because there was no aviation fuel to fly with. Some of the last kamikaze recruits were practicing on gliders. American B-29 bombers were flying over Japan almost every night. On the night of March 9th into March 10th, 334 American bombers had come over Tokyo carrying incendiary bombs. When the sun came up on March 10th, official Japanese counts recorded 83,000 people dead in one night. Many historians believe the real number was over 100,000. More than either atomic bomb would kill later that summer. 16 square miles of Tokyo had simply ceased to exist. The wind of the fires had been so hot that the water in the canals had boiled. 67 Japanese cities were burned. Roughly 40% of Japan's total urban area was destroyed. The rice harvest of 1945 would be the worst since 1909. Industrial workers were surviving on 1,680 calories per day. That is a starvation diet. And still the government would not surrender. Instead they announced a new doctrine. Its name in Japanese was Ikyoku Gyokusai, the 100 million shattered jewels. It was the official policy of Imperial Japan in the summer of 1945 that the entire population of the Japanese Empire, 100 million men, women and children, would die together in a final defense of the home islands rather than accept surrender. 10,000 aircraft were being held back for kamikaze attacks against the expected American invasion. Millions of civilians were being drilled with bamboo spears. School children were being trained to strap explosives to their bodies and roll under American tanks. From "we have practically won already" to 100 million shattered jewels in less than 4 years. That was the distance. That was the price of misjudging America. Then came the 2 bombs. Hiroshima on August 6, Nagasaki on August 9. On September 2, 1945, on the deck of the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, Japanese officials in top hats and morning coats signed an unconditional surrender. And in the months that followed, the men who had led Japan into the war met their own final reckoning. Prince Fumimaro Kono, the aristocratic former prime minister who had tried to arrange a summit with President Roosevelt in 1941 to stop the war before it began, gave one last interview before his arrest. What he said should be remembered. The Emperor and I, and most of the cabinet, were for acceptance of the American terms that we withdraw from China. But Tojo, with the backing of the military, violently opposed it. On the morning of December 16, 1945, the very day he was scheduled to report to Sugamo prison as a suspected war criminal, Kono took cyanide in his home. He was 54 years old. Hideki Tojo, the man who had smiled and declared the war already won, tried to kill himself on September 11, 1945, when American soldiers came to arrest him. He shot himself in the chest with a small .32 caliber pistol. He missed his heart. American doctors saved his life so he could stand trial. He was hanged at Sugamo prison on December 23, 1948. At the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal a year before his execution, when the question of Pearl Harbor was put to him, Hideki Tojo did not defend himself with grand speeches. He did not blame his advisors. He did not blame the emperor. He said 4 words. Yes, I am responsible. He was. But the responsibility went deeper than one man or one cabinet or one attack. It went into a system of belief. A system that had convinced itself that comfort meant weakness. That factories were less than spirit. That an ocean of American workers would never march together because they were too different, too free, too spoiled to fight. Japan had never lacked the intelligence to know better. They had the data. They had the reports. They had, in Isoroku Yamamoto, a man who had told them plainly and repeatedly that this war could not be won. He had said it in Tokyo. He had said it to school children. He had put it in writing to the Prime Minister. The system had not lacked the information. It had lacked the willingness to listen to it. That is the deepest lesson of the Pacific War. Not that Japan was foolish. Japan was not foolish. Japan was full of brilliant men. It was that a country can have all the intelligence in the world and still walk off a cliff, if its politics punish the people who tell the truth. Yamamoto had told the truth. And so they sent him to sea, partly to protect him from his own countrymen, partly to make him fight a war he had told them not to start. And in the end, guided by codebreakers reading his own mail, American pilots killed him over the jungles of Bougainville with his hands still closed around the hilt of a sword he could not use. And now one last picture.